The saloon fell silent, except for the creak of old wood and the distant howl of desert wind. She had always known this day would come, the day her father's whiskey-soaked words would force her to choose between blood and conscience. The amber light filtering through dusty windows caught the tremor in her hand, not from fear, but from the weight of a daughter's love dying in real time. "Shoot him and you'll be buying my drinks next," he had sneered, and in that moment 23 years of believing in him crumbled like sun-baked clay. His daughter stood firm, knowing that some lines, once crossed, leave you forever changed. Subscribe now to witness a story that will remind you why courage often comes with the highest price. The dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon light that cut through the broken wheel saloon like a blade, illuminating the space between father and daughter in a way that made the air itself seem heavy with unspoken truths. Sarah McKenna had ridden into Deadwood Creek that morning, with her father's letter burning in her saddlebag, the paper worn soft from her fingers, tracing the words that had summoned her home after 3 years of silence. She had expected many things, his graying beard, his weathered hands, perhaps even his anger, but she had not expected to find him here, in this place that reeked of spilled whiskey and broken dreams, pointing a trembling gun at a man whose only crime was asking for the money her father owed. The stranger stood with his back to the bar, hands raised but steady, his eyes never leaving her father's face, with a patience that spoke of men who had learned to read death in other men's eyes. Her father's voice, when it came, was thick with drink and something else, something that sounded like the last gasps of a man drowning in his own choices. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. "Shoot him, and you'll be buying my drinks next." And Sarah felt something inside her chest crack like ice under the weight of spring. She had come home to save him, but now she wondered if the man she had loved was already gone. The floorboards beneath her boots seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of every soul who had ever stood in this place and faced a moment that would define them forever. Her hand rested on the grip of her own pistol, the metal warm from her body heat, and she could feel the weight of every lesson he had taught her about right and wrong pressing down on her shoulders like stones. The man at the bar, young, clean-shaven, with the kind of honest face that belonged in church pews rather than saloons, kept his gaze steady on her father, but she could see the slight tightening around his eyes that betrayed his fear. Behind the bar, the keeper had gone still as death, his hands frozen on the glass he had been cleaning, and the few other patrons had melted into the shadows like ghosts, afraid to witness what was coming. Her father's gun hand shook with more than just the tremors of a man who had made whiskey his closest companion, and Sarah realized with a clarity that cut through her like winter wind that this was not the first time he had stood in this position. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap, and she found herself remembering the man who had taught her to ride, to shoot, to stand up for what was right, even when the whole world was against her. That man felt like a stranger now. The afternoon light shifted, casting longer shadows across the scarred wooden floor, and Sarah could smell the desert beyond the saloon doors, sage and dust, and the promise of rain that might never come. Her father's breathing was labored, each exhale carrying the weight of choices that had led him to this moment, and she wondered how many nights he had spent in places like this, drowning the memory of the man he used to be. The stranger's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but firm. "I don't want trouble, McKenna, just what you owe." The words were simple, honest, and they seemed to hit her father like physical blows, causing him to sway slightly on his feet. Sarah felt her own breathing slow, the way it did when she was lining up a difficult shot, and she realized that everything in her life had been leading to this moment. Every lesson, every disappointment, every small betrayal that had prepared her for this larger one. The gun in her father's hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, and she could see the war being fought behind his bloodshot eyes, the battle between the man he had been and the man he had become. She thought of her mother, dead these 5 years, and wondered what she would say if she could see them now, father and daughter facing each other across a chasm that seemed too wide to bridge. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears like thunder, and Sarah found herself studying her father's face as if seeing it for the first time. The deep lines carved by sun and sorrow, the grey stubble that spoke of mornings when he couldn't bear to look at himself in the mirror, the eyes that had once sparkled with laughter and now held only the dull gleam of a man who had lost his way. She remembered the stories he used to tell her about honor and courage, about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, and the bitter irony of this moment settled in her stomach like poison. The stranger shifted slightly, his boots scraping against the floor, and the sound seemed to echo through the saloon like a gunshot, causing everyone to tense as if the very air might explode. Her father's lips moved silently, and she realized he was counting 1, 2, 3, the way he had taught her to do before making any important decision. But his counting seemed to go on forever, as if he were trying to find a number that would make this all make sense. The weight of her own gun seemed to increase with each heartbeat, and she found herself wondering if this was how it felt to grow up, not gradually, but all at once, in a single moment that stripped away every illusion you had ever held about the people you loved. The silence stretched on, fragile as spun glass, waiting for someone to shatter it. Her father's eyes found hers across the dim space of the saloon, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the man she remembered, the one who had carried her on his shoulders through summer fields, who had taught her that a person's word was the only currency that truly mattered. But the moment passed like smoke, and she was left staring at a stranger who wore her father's face but carried none of his honor. The gun in his hand wavered, the barrel describing small circles in the air, as if he were trying to write his name in the dust motes. And Sarah realized that he was waiting for her to make the choice he couldn't make himself. The stranger at the bar remained perfectly still, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set as if he were preparing himself for whatever came next. Outside, a horse whinnied, and the sound seemed to come from another world, a world where fathers protected their daughters instead of asking them to become accomplices to their shame. The amber light continued to slant through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow, and Sarah thought about how beautiful the world could be, even in its ugliest moments. She took a breath that seemed to fill not just her lungs, but her entire being, and when she spoke, her voice was steady as bedrock. "Put the gun down, Pa." The words hung in the air like a prayer, simple and clear, and carrying the weight of everything she had ever believed about right and wrong. Her father's face crumpled, as if she had struck him, and she saw tears begin to track down his weathered cheeks, cutting clean lines through the dust and despair that had settled there. The gun in his hand seemed to grow impossibly heavy, and she watched as his arm began to lower, degree by painful degree, until the barrel pointed at the floor instead of at the stranger's heart. The silence that followed was different from the one that had come before, not the tense quiet of impending violence, but the hollow echo of something breaking that could never be repaired. She had saved a man's life, but she had lost her father in the process, and the weight of that trade settled on her shoulders like a mantle she would carry for the rest of her days. The gun hit the floor with a sound like thunder, metal against wood echoing through the saloon, with a finality that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Sarah watched her father's shoulders collapse inward as if the weapon had been the only thing holding him upright, and she realized that this moment would be carved into her memory like words on a tombstone, the day she became the parent and he became the child. The stranger at the bar slowly lowered his hands, his movements careful and deliberate, and she could see the relief flooding through him like water through a broken dam, though his eyes remained wary, as if he couldn't quite believe the danger had passed. Her father stood swaying in the amber light, his face a map of devastation that spoke of dreams abandoned and promises broken, and Sarah felt something inside her chest that might have been her heart, learning how to break in a new way. The other patrons began to stir from their frozen positions, whispers starting to ripple through the saloon like wind through dry grass. And she knew that by sundown the story would be told in every corner of Deadwood Creek, how Thomas McKenna's own daughter had talked him down from murder. The weight of their stares pressed against her skin like brands, marking her as the girl who had chosen a stranger over her own blood, though she knew in her bones that she had chosen something far more important than blood. The taste of dust and disappointment filled her mouth, and she wondered if this was what growing up really meant, learning that love sometimes required you to wound the people you cared about most. Her father's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, cracked and broken like old leather left too long in the sun. "Sarah, But the words died in his throat, and she could see him struggling with the weight of everything he wanted to say and couldn't find the courage to voice. The stranger straightened slowly, his hand moving to his vest pocket where he withdrew a folded piece of paper. The debt, she realized, the thing that had brought them all to this moment, and she watched as he placed it carefully on the bar, as if it were made of something more precious than paper and ink. Her father's eyes followed the movement with the desperate attention of a drowning man watching a rope being thrown. And Sarah understood that this debt was more than money. It was the last thread connecting him to the man he used to be. The saloon keeper resumed his glass cleaning with movements that were too careful, too deliberate, as if the simple act of wiping away water spots could somehow clean the stain of what they had all witnessed. She could feel the desert wind pushing against the doors, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of storms that might wash the world clean. But she knew that some things could never be washed away. The floorboards beneath her feet seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of every soul who had ever stood in this place and faced the moment when they had to choose between who they were and who they wanted to be. The stranger's voice cut through the heavy air like a blade, quiet but carrying the weight of finality. "The debt dies here, McKenna. Consider it paid." The words hit her father like physical blows, and Sarah watched as he raised his head to stare at the young man with something that might have been wonder or might have been despair. She realized that this act of mercy was somehow more devastating than any violence could have been, because it forced her father to confront not just what he had almost done, but what kind of man he had become, that such mercy was necessary. The paper on the bar seemed to glow in the amber light, and she found herself thinking about all the things that piece of paper represented: gambling debts, broken promises, the slow erosion of a man's honor, one drink at a time. Her father took a step toward the bar, his movements uncertain, as if he were walking on ice that might crack beneath his weight, and she could see him struggling with the urge to reach for the paper, to tear it up, to somehow undo the chain of choices that had led them here. The silence stretched between them all like a rope pulled taut, and Sarah realized that this was the moment when everything would change, not just for her father, but for all of them, because they had all been witnesses to something that would mark them forever. She thought about the stories her father used to tell her about redemption, about second chances, and wondered if such things were possible for a man who had fallen as far as he had. The afternoon light continued to slant through the dusty windows, painting everything in shades of gold and regret, and Sarah found herself memorizing every detail of this moment, the way her father's hands shook as he reached for the bar to steady himself, the careful way the stranger folded the debt paper and tucked it back into his pocket, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears like wind through canyon walls. She could feel the weight of her gun against her hip, a reminder of the choice she had made and the line she had drawn, and she wondered if her father would ever forgive her for saving him from himself. The other patrons had begun to drift away, melting back into the shadows as if they could somehow escape the gravity of what they had witnessed. But Sarah knew that none of them would ever forget this moment. the day Thomas McKenna's daughter became the stronger one. Her father's eyes found hers again, and this time she saw something different in them, not the desperate cunning of a cornered animal, but the hollow recognition of a man who had looked into the abyss of his own soul and found it wanting. The taste of ashes filled her mouth, and she realized that this was what it meant to love someone enough to let them fall, to refuse to catch them when catching them would only enable them to fall further. The weight of that knowledge settled in her chest like a stone, heavy and permanent, and somehow necessary. Outside, a horse whinnied again, and the sound seemed to call to something deep inside her. The part that remembered open ranges and endless skies, and the feeling of being free from the weight of other people's choices. Her father straightened slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, and she could see him trying to gather the scattered pieces of his dignity like a man collecting coins from a torn purse. The stranger had turned to face the door, his business here finished, but he paused at the threshold and looked back at her father with something that might have been pity or might have been understanding. "There's always tomorrow, McKenna," he said quietly, and the words carried more weight than any threat could have, because they offered something more dangerous than violence. They offered hope. Sarah watched her father's face as the words hit him, saw the way his features crumpled and reformed as if he were trying on different expressions to see which one fit this new version of himself. The saloon doors swung shut behind the stranger with a sound like a coffin closing, and suddenly the space felt too small, too close, filled with the ghosts of words that could never be taken back, and choices that could never be unmade. She looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw not the giant of her childhood, but a broken man who had somehow raised a daughter strong enough to save him from his own weakness. The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. Not the tense quiet of impending violence or the hollow echo of something breaking, but the deep, profound stillness that comes after a storm has passed and left the world forever changed. Her father's voice, when he finally found it, was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so goddamn sorry." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, and she realized that this was the first honest thing he had said to her in years. Maybe the first honest thing he had said to anyone. She wanted to go to him, to wrap her arms around him and tell him that everything would be all right. But she knew that would be a lie. And she had learned today that some truths were too important to soften with comfortable lies. Instead, she stood her ground and let the weight of his apology settle between them, like a bridge that might someday be strong enough to cross. The taste of dust and regret filled the air, and Sarah McKenna realized that she had just lived through the moment when she stopped being her father's daughter and became her own woman, forged in the fire of a choice that would define her for the rest of her days. The saloon had emptied like water through cracked wood, leaving only the three of them in a space that felt both too large and suffocatingly small. Sarah's hand remained steady on her gun, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The stranger sat motionless, his dark eyes moving between father and daughter, with the careful attention of a man who had witnessed too many family tragedies to count. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters and sending tumbleweeds skittering past the grimy windows like lost souls searching for home. Her father's face had turned the color of old leather left too long in the sun, a mixture of shame and rage warring beneath his weathered features. The bottle in his hand trembled slightly, amber liquid catching the lamplight and throwing fractured reflections across the scarred wooden table. Sarah could smell the whiskey on his breath from 10 feet away, that familiar scent that had become the soundtrack of her childhood disappointments. She remembered when that same breath had whispered bedtime stories, when those same hands had braided her hair with gentle fingers that knew nothing of violence or betrayal. "You don't understand what you're doing, girl," her father said, his voice cracking like dry timber under pressure. The words came out thick and slurred, but beneath the alcohol was something else, a pleading note that made Sarah's chest tighten with unwanted sympathy. She had heard that tone before, in the dark hours after her mother's funeral, when he thought she was sleeping, and he spoke to empty air about forgiveness and second chances. But those moments of vulnerability had become fewer and farther between, buried under layers of bitterness and the false courage that came from the bottom of a bottle. The stranger finally spoke, his voice low and measured like distant thunder before a storm. "Ma'am, I appreciate what you're doing, but this isn't your fight to finish." His words carried the weight of experience, the careful cadence of a man who had learned that the wrong phrase at the wrong moment could turn a tense situation into a bloodbath. Sarah's eyes flicked to him briefly, taking in the way he sat perfectly still, despite the gun pointed in his direction, the way his hands rested calmly on the table as if death were merely an old acquaintance he might or might not greet today. "It became my fight the moment he chose whiskey over honor," Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, carrying with them the accumulated weight of years of disappointment and broken promises. She thought of all the times she had made excuses for him, all the times she had cleaned up his messes and smoothed over his mistakes with neighbors and creditors, and anyone else who had been unfortunate enough to cross paths with Thomas McKenna on one of his darker days. Her father's laugh was bitter and hollow, echoing off the empty walls like the sound of something precious breaking beyond repair. "Honor," he repeated, spitting the word out like it tasted of poison. "What do you know about honor, Sarah? What do any of us know about it anymore?" His eyes were red-rimmed and wild, and for a moment she saw not the man who had raised her, but a stranger wearing her father's face, someone she didn't recognize and wasn't sure she wanted to know. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Sarah's mind drifted unbidden to a memory from years past, when she was 12, and her father had taught her to shoot tin cans off the fence posts behind their ranch house. His hands had been steady then, guiding hers with patient precision, his voice warm with pride as she hit target after target. "A McKenna never misses what matters," he had told her, his smile bright as summer sunshine. Now those same hands shook with drink and rage, and she wondered if he even remembered the girl he had taught to be strong. The stranger shifted slightly in his chair, the leather of his holster creaking softly in the oppressive quiet. Sarah caught the movement in her peripheral vision, but kept her focus on her father, knowing that any distraction could prove fatal in a situation balanced on such a knife's edge. She could see the calculations running behind the stranger's dark eyes, the way he was measuring distances and angles, preparing for whatever violence might come. There was something almost sad about his resignation, as if he had played out this scene too many times before, in too many dusty towns with too many broken families. "Your mother would be ashamed," her father said suddenly, the words cutting through the air like a blade drawn across tender skin. Sarah felt the impact of them in her chest, a physical pain that made her breath catch and her vision blur for just a moment. It was a low blow, invoking the memory of the woman who had died trying to birth the son Thomas McKenna had always wanted. The woman whose grave Sarah visited every Sunday with wildflowers picked from the meadow where they used to walk together on summer evenings. But instead of breaking her resolve, the mention of her mother only strengthened it, like steel tempered in fire. "Mama would be ashamed of what you've become," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a quiet fury that seemed to fill the entire room. "She would be ashamed that you're threatening an innocent man because you're too drunk and too proud to admit you're wrong." The words came from a place deep inside her, a well of disappointment and grief that she had been carrying for years without fully understanding its weight. Her father's face crumpled for a moment, the mask of anger slipping to reveal something raw and wounded underneath. She saw him as he truly was, not a villain or a monster, but a broken man who had lost his way in the wilderness of his own pain. The realization should have made her feel sympathy, should have softened her heart toward the man who had once been her hero. Instead, it only made her sadder, because she understood now that some kinds of brokenness couldn't be fixed with love or patience or hope. The stranger cleared his throat softly, drawing their attention back to the present moment. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we could all walk away from this. No harm done, no blood spilled, no regrets to carry into tomorrow." His suggestion hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning swimmers, an offer of salvation that seemed almost too good to be true. Sarah wanted to believe it was possible, wanted to imagine that they could all simply stand up and walk out into the desert night as if nothing had happened, as if the last hour had been nothing more than a bad dream. But even as the stranger spoke his words of peace, Sarah could see the truth written in her father's eyes, the stubborn pride that had always been his greatest weakness, the inability to back down even when backing down was the only sane choice. She had seen that look before, in the moments before he had challenged the banker who foreclosed on their neighbor's farm, in the seconds before he had thrown the first punch in a dozen bar-room brawls that had accomplished nothing except adding to his reputation as a man to be avoided. It was the look of someone who had confused destruction with strength, who had forgotten that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was admit they were wrong. "I can't," her father said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute finality. "I can't let him walk away. Not after what he did to the Hendersons." The name hung between them like a curse, bringing with it memories of smoke and flames and a family destroyed by circumstances that no one fully understood. Sarah had heard the stories, had seen the way people's faces changed when they spoke of that terrible night, but she had never believed her father capable of the kind of justice that came from the barrel of a gun. The stranger's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tensing that spoke of a man preparing for the inevitable. "The Hendersons," he said quietly, "died in a fire that started from a knocked-over lamp. I was there trying to help them escape, not cause their deaths." His words carried the ring of truth, but Sarah could see that truth would not be enough to penetrate the wall of grief and alcohol that surrounded her father's judgment like armor made of pain. She felt the moment crystallizing around her, becoming something solid and unchangeable, like water turning to ice in the depths of winter. Every choice she had ever made, every lesson she had ever learned, every dream she had ever harbored about the woman she wanted to become, all of it was leading to this single instant when she would have to choose between the father who had raised her and the principles he had taught her. The irony was not lost on her that in order to honor his teachings, she would have to stand against him. "Daddy," she said, using the childhood name she hadn't spoken in years, hoping that the sound of it might reach whatever part of him still remembered love over vengeance. "Please, put the gun down. Let's go home." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, because she knew, even as she spoke it, that home was something they had lost long before tonight, something that had died slowly over the years, like a flower deprived of water and sunlight. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of the little girl who used to wait for him on the porch every evening, watching the horizon for the dust cloud that would announce his return from whatever work had taken him away that day. But the moment passed like a shadow across the sun, and when he looked at her again, she saw only the stranger he had become, the man who had chosen whiskey and bitterness over the daughter who had needed him to be better than his pain. The sound of his gun clearing leather was like thunder in the confined space, and Sarah knew with crystalline clarity that the time for words had passed, that the next few seconds would determine not just who lived and who died, but who she would be for the rest of her life, a woman who had stood for what was right, or a daughter who had chosen blood over justice when the moment of truth finally arrived.